Hello, guys. Welcome to Psych Minds. We are reading Ordinary People by Judith Guest. If you have not subscribed yet to the channel, do subscribe, like, and share. We are on chapter 21. She looks up from the checks she's writing at her desk in the bedroom. When would we go? March 13th. It's a Friday. Tournament starts on Saturday, runs until Monday, the 16th. All right, she puts down her pen. Would we stay with Ward and Audrey? If you like, I'll write to them. Good. Not a trip to Europe, but he can do this for her. Take her to visit her brother. Ward Butler is big and loud, nothing like his sister in looks or temperament. Married a woman just like himself, easy people to like and to be with, and she is as close to Ward as she is to anybody, as close as she is to me. He wanders from the bedroom to the family room downstairs, makes himself a drink at the bar, a quiet Saturday night for a change. Conrad is out for the evening. He didn't say where, only that he wouldn't be late. He flips idly through a stack of record albums on the stereo, pulls out a London Symphony by Vaughan Williams, the only symphony with which he has ever become familiar. He remembers the music, lit course Beth was taking when they met, all those inane lyrics they put to the main themes to help her study for the exams. The power of suggestion. That particular symphony does make him think of Europe, although not London specifically, just all the places they have been. Spain, Toledo, with its street narrower than any alley he has seen, and those outdoor stalls with seafood, fresh fruits, hand knitted shawls, hand tooled leather belts, those delicate carvings on the handles of swords and knives. What was it called? God, his memory is failing again. Senility setting in. The smell of boxwood, Grenada. In the monastery where they stayed, Parador de San Francisco, the gardens were laid out so neatly, with fountains and stone benches and stones inlaid on the walkways, so beautiful and unreal. And yet, with the unreality, and considering the timing of it, Con still is in the hospital, Jordan dead less than a year. They had been happy there, away from home, away from all of it. Everything seemed orderly and safe. Safety and order, definitely the priorities of his life. He is not a man inclined towards risk. There, a definition at last. I'm a man who believes in safety. Christ, is that all? Is that why decisions are so difficult? No. He would have classed Arnold Bacon as a man who believed in order and in safety. Yet Arnold had no trouble with decisions. Arnold had written him off without hesitation when he had married Beth. He had been re-evaluated, found wanting. The subsidy was withdrawn, the offer of a future partnership in Arnold's firm disappearing with it. It seemed at the time a terrible misunderstanding, no way to put it right, not with telephone calls or letters after the fact. And it was not the withdrawal of the subsidy that meant nothing. The withdrawal of friendship, that was what had crushed him. After 5 years of looking up to someone, of thinking of him as a father. You had a goal once, Arnold told him over the phone. You were going to be the best tax attorney in the state, remember? Sure, and once I wanted to be a fireman. Then I met you. He had been angry then, but he hadn't really meant that his goals had changed, and in vain he argued that a man can have more than one goal at a time. That he had not abandoned one for the other. He just no longer wanted to think of himself as the kid from evangelical home. He wanted a family, a wife, people to share his goals with, as the kid from evangelical home. Then you have made a bad choice, Bacon observed. She is not a sharer, Calvin. It's you who will end up doing all the sharing. Bitterness talking. He had understood that. There had been on contact, instant hatred between Arnold and Beth. She had referred to him after the very first meeting as Arnold Fagin, had never missed an opportunity to point out the ways that Arnold worked to control him, to own him, she said. Between those two whom he loved, he had tried to wedge his own wants, his own needs, sitting nervously on the fence. It hadn't worked. His eyes blur suddenly and he blinks back tears, furious at himself. Since that visit with Berger, all manner of internal wheels have been set in motion, heaving up thoughts he has not encountered in years. Old stuff. Too late to do anything about it, and what could have he done? Gone to his funeral? What for? To pay his respects to a man who would have nothing to do with him for the last 15 or so years of his life? No, all over. It had not been him anyway who made the decision. It had been Arnold. So maybe Beth had been right. Maybe people did use other people according to their own needs. It had not felt like ownership to him. But afterwards, what else could he call it? He had not lived up to his end of the bargain. Therefore, Arnold had cut him loose, gotten rid of him. People use according to their own needs or don't use them. When a primary need is one of the safety, is that why he has never gotten involved with a secretary, a girl in a bar, a client, a friend's wife? Is it because he loves her or because he is afraid? Affairs, they are common knowledge, discussed, just as they say in the locker room of the clubs he has belonged to. Women everywhere, hundreds of opportunities, thousands of attractions, then why not him? The closest he has ever come was 10 years ago. A woman lawyer he knew, Molly Davis, her client and his were considering a private merger. They had worked together on it for several weeks and he felt the vibration. They could have worked out a private merger of their own. So why didn't they? What had happened? So long ago it is hard to remember it. It seems that he had quietly and simply one day turned it off before it had gotten started. Priorities again. Safety and order. Infidelity is a dangerous business. People get hurt, and she does not forgive. She never forgave Arnold for what? For simply being Arnold. No, too easy. Pushing it off on her. Face it, you are not hungry, man, sexually or otherwise. You were content. You never looked. But in any case, she would not have forgiven him. They had discussed it once after Ray and Nancy. If I were her, she had said, I would never come back. Not for a house in Glencoe. Not for the children, not for anything. It is too humiliating. Why? She loves him. What does it matter? It doesn't. It matters that we know about it, she said. Suppose nobody knew about it, then would it be humiliating? I would know, she said. And you would know. That's enough. The thrill of fear had touched him. Is it that some people are not given a capacity for forgiveness, just as some are cheated out of beauty by a pointed nose, or not allowed the adequate amount of brain matter? It is not in her nature to forgive. No, that is absurd. Again, a reducing of the complicated dimension of life to a formula that is more simple than sensible. It comes from too much thinking. He rises in disgust, setting his glass down on the bar. Too much thinking merely causes him to feel vaguely that he is on the point of learning something, only to have the circuits blocked, the answers inaccessible. Chapter 22. On impulse, he attends a swim meet after school. He sits alone behind a group of freshmen, short boys, tall girls. The air is moist and hot. Coats and sweaters are piled everywhere. The girls turn around to rearrange clothes, to tuck scarves and gloves into her coat sleeves, to stare. The boys watch the meet. They voice loud, unflattering opinions of the home team. Jesus, they stink, one kid says in disgust, and Conrad feels oddly hurt by the remark. Defensive, but it is true. Their record, 1 win, 4 losses, and they should be better. Lesenby, a dependable breaststroker, plenty of talent in the freestyle. Truan, the best backstroker around, maybe even as good as Buck. Still, they don't have it. For the first time, he feels a twinge of regret. Maybe he could have helped. Watching Salan as he shouts encouragement to Bill Danoff, his best in the 200-meter freestyle, he wonders about Lesenby's remark that day in the hall. No, Salan is a man of his word. Actions have consequences. Lord Jim and all that. Afterward, he hangs around. The crowd thins out and he heads for the lower doors, passing the stairway that leads to the locker rooms. Laughter surges upward from the stairwell. He recognizes the voices. Come on, guys, move it. My goddamn ass is melting. Lisenby pleads. Your goddamn ass could use it, Genthe says. He hesitates, then he moves on towards the door, his book slung under his wrist against his hip. It is dark, and he has to pick his way around pools of half melted snow in the parking lot. Warmed briefly this afternoon by the sun, the puddles are bubbled over now, thin sheets of ice that will not hold weight. Behind him, the doors burst open, shouts of laughter put forward, push outward. Glad you can laugh about it, Gente. It sure as hell wasn't funny. Ah, come on, we weren't that bad. Face it, we got waxed. We stunk. Truan, no kidding. I don't know how you can listen to that lecture one more time about Buck Jarrett, the old time great swimmer of the world. Jesus, he bores the crap out of me when he does that. You think he's ever gonna quit kissing the guy's picture? An abrupt silence. It stabs deeper than the words. Someone says, "Shut the fuck up, will you?" He continues across the parking lot, reaching into his back pocket for his keys, the blood thick behind his eyes, his throat tight. The lot is nearly empty of cars. It is slippery and wet. He misses one puddle, steps into another, and icy water oozes through the seam of his boot. Hey, Con! Lesenby comes up behind him. He turns, gives him a blank smile. Could have used you today, buddy, Truan says. I don't think so. Lesenby laughs. He's right, nobody could help us today. How's it going, Jarrett? Stillman materializes out of the darkness, checking out the Lehmans, swift and professional. Your old man's so lauded. What? How come he didn't get you a frigging Eldorado? I tried not to let it ruin my Christmas. His voice sounds wooden and expressionless in his ears. He's surprised when they laugh. Truan says, I heard you were going out with Pratt. No kidding, Lisenby says. Since when? He cannot answer. The blood is still pounding. His throat is scratchy, hot. Stillman flashes the grin. How you doing? You in her pants yet? Do me a favor, he says. Try not to be such a prick. I know it won't be easy for you. They stop walking and eye each other warily. Truan backs up, getting himself out of the way. Hey, you guys, Lisenby says. Man, Stillman says. You're the prick. Guys like you who walk around acting like you are king, shit. You give me a goddamn pain in the ass. Something explodes inside his head. The sound shattering the parking lot, the red brick walls of building behind him, the white doors, grey cement, all dissolving into broken bits of colors, heading swiftly towards him as he slams his fist hard against that face. A sweet rush of mindless ecstasy washes out everything in perfect release and makes him whole again. The rough feel of cloth tearing in his hands as he holds on, shoving, pushing, and they go down together on the gravel. Stillman's arm is around his neck, his hand digging, punching at his back. God damn you, Jarrett. He hits him again. Everything is bathed in yellow light now, faded like an overexposed photograph, and again he hits him. As miles away, someone calls his name, Connie! And he is grabbed suddenly from behind. Swung roughly around, he hits out again. Cut it out, someone says. Cut it out! A second explosion in the pit of his stomach. He doubles over. A solid wall of pain is packed into his lung. There is no room for air. The passage is blocked and he has lost the secret, the rhythm of breathing. He gasps and the wall dissolves. Behind it, there is only a hole filled with pain. You okay? It is Lesenby holding him up. He straightens slowly, looks at Stillman, lying on the ground, legs sprawled, on elbow crooked high over his face, something white in his fist, a handkerchief. He is rocking slowly. Truan and Gente bend over him, helping him up. He takes the handkerchief down, looks at it, moaning. Blood pours from his nose. The yellow light is receding, the photograph coming into focus. Rough gravel and slush underneath their feet. Truan, Gente, Lesenby, Van Buren. Two other guys he doesn't know who came to watch. There is sound, but it's garbled and he cannot understand it. He doesn't want to. He walks away, brushing something wet from the front of his jacket. His knees are trembling. His face feels loose and watery. He gets into his car and sits, holding onto the steering wheel. His hands hurt. The knuckles are scraped raw. and he flexes them on the wheel. He reaches behind him, feeling for his keys in his back pocket. They are not there. They were somewhere out in the parking lot along with his books. He rests his forehead on the wheel, fatigue, and another feeling that he cannot identify, moving in, trying to overcome him. The door on his right opens. His books are tossed in on the seat. Lesenby leans across and hands him his car keys. Thanks. He takes them without looking. The door stays open a minute. Then Lesenby gets in, slams it closed behind him. I want to talk. The darkness outside is dense, illuminated at intervals by a bluish glow from the parking lot lights. He stares at the dashboard, holding the keys lightly in his hand. The guys are nothing, Lesenby says. A zero upstairs. What would you expect from somebody whose class votes him least likely to grow up? Listen, you used to know that about him, Connie. Since fourth grade, you have known it. So? So you make yourself look stupid when you let him get to you like that? So I look stupid, he says. Is that the message? No, no, it isn't. Lesenby looks away, staring out into the darkness. What is it with you, man? We have been friends for a long time. Lace, he says. We are still friends. Are we? Lesenby's voice is flat, strained. Look, I don't know why you want to be alone in this, but I wouldn't shit you. Man, I miss him too. A blow he is not expecting at all. He concentrates on the cold bunching of metal, his car keys under his hand, against his thigh. He looks out at the bare black lime tree. I can't help it, he says. It hurts too much to be around you. The keys dig into his thigh. Next to him, Lesenby sits, elbow against the door, his hand propping his cheek. What he said is true. The three of them were always together. Why does he think of it as only his grief? Because damn it, it is. His room no longer shared, his heart torn and slammed against this solid wall of it, the hell of indifference. It is, and there is no way to change it. That is the hell. His heart pounds painfully in his chest. He slowly slows his breathing with an effort, staring out at the window at nothing. I've got to go. Lesenby stirs, not looking at him. Yeah, okay. The door opens and he's gone. Conrad waits until he has crossed the parking lot and gotten into the red Mustang. He lets him pull out first, holding himself tight. Control is all he will not. Not here, not again. He lets himself into the house with his key. Wednesday. His father is working late on tax returns. His mother is playing tennis. The house is quiet, empty, good. He does not want to talk. He looks down at his jacket. Blood drying into the brown suede. He should try to get it off. It feels stiff under his fingers. He sinks into a chair in the kitchen, staring wearily at the wall. He takes off the jacket. There is blood on his shirt, flecks all over it as if he had slapped a loaded paintbrush against his hand. He strips to his undershirt and works a while at the stains on the jacket. The blood runs off into the sink, a pale brown that mixes with the water and looks like beef broth. Carefully rinses his hand. He lays the jacket on the counter. He takes the shirt into the laundry room. Maybe she won't notice, or else she will think it is mud. No, he scrapes at the spots with the thumbnail. Pinpoints of brownish dye on the pale blue fabric. No, too definite. Mud would blur, rub out. He holds the shirt under the faucet, runs water over it. The spots dissolve, washed away in the sink. He squeezes the water out of it and throws it in the dryer, spins the dial to on. Since they were little, they have gotten this. Getting rid of the evidence, Buck called it. He shivers suddenly. The house feels cold. He heads for the kitchen again, searches for the refrigerator for the TV dinners. Brought for him for Wednesday, fried chicken, peas and carrot, mashed potatoes, apple slices. He turns on the oven, take the dinner out of the cardboard envelope, tear back foil to expose chicken, cook 35 to 40 minutes. Obey all rules and do as directed. Punishment may be lessened. Don't doubt that there will be punishment. Punishment, of course, for losing control. Always one of life's unwritten laws. He heats water in the tea kettle, looks in the cupboard for the jar of instant coffee, sees Stillman suddenly lying on the ground knees, raised his mouth, a round O of surprise, his eyes widened, the head snapped back. God damn you, Jarrett. A cold sensation in the pit of his stomach, his skin prickling with fear. How many times did I hit him? He sits at the table to eat his dinner. No TV tonight, and no music. Each small punishment he inflicts could lessen the larger one, but it was no big deal, just a stupid fight. The telephone rings, sharp and insistent, and his stomach knots. He lets it ring. 9, 10, 11 times. It stops. His father, maybe. He sometimes calls on Wednesday to talk over the day, to have him pass a message to his mother. Surely it was him. Or who else? He looks down at his dinner, quickly looks away, out of control. Don't doubt that there will be punishment. It was Stillman's father calling from the hospital. His nose is broken, his jaw is broken, and he sees them all again. Truan, Van Buren, Kenthe, all watching the parking lot, a huge stage lit up, and Mr. Knight telling his father they must expel him. He's dangerous. They cannot have these attacks occurring in the parking lot. No control. It is shameful, terrible. Oh God, I didn't mean to. He picks up his dinner, goes to the sink with it, and flushes it down the disposer. He stares out the window into the chill February darkness. How many times did I hit him? And how will he be punished? He doesn't want to think about it. He could punish himself first. But how? You're always fucking up. You never meant to mean to? Never mean to doesn't mean shit. He picks up his coffee cup and drinks the scalding liquid. It burns his mouth as he swallows it. A hot blur of pain in his throat, in his chest. He stands rigidly at attention, absorbing it, knowing that it is not enough. Not enough. And it wasn't Stillman anyway. It wasn't even him, but some other fucking bastard. I didn't even know who said it. The world is full of fucking bastards, so it's all pointless. You can't fight everybody. And what goddamn difference would it make if you could? He goes to the laundry room, retrieving his shirt from the dryer. The spots are gone. It is clean, warm, and he slips it on and goes to sit on the couch in the den. He leans his head back. His body feels churned up, brutalized. He needs to move around, but he will not allow this either. He will allow himself to comforts tonight. He will allow himself no comforts tonight. Waiting is part of the punishment. So he waits. Chapter 23. The distance between people, in miles, in time, in thought, staggering when you think about it. Here he is driving on the Edens and he catches a glimpse in the lane to his left of a passing car. The driver is raising an angry finger at him behind the double space of window glass separating them, and he is amazed. What has he done to deserve this gesture of contempt? Of course, glancing at his speedometer, he understands. 30 miles an hour. You don't do this to the Edens. Drive 30 in a 50-mile zone. Even at 11:30 at night, it gets you more than an obscenity. It can get you into an accident. No thanks, no more. The quota is all used up. Well, he should catch up with the driver. Thank him for the reminder. Really, it was an act of kindness. Only the guy would not understand, would suspect him of playing some kind of game, of trying to get back at him. Communication, the bridge between the distances. He passes a sign high off the highway and to his left. Are you on the right road? In the shape of a cross, leaves and flowers entwined around it. That is not communication. That is alienation. Like the car he saw one day on 194, a huge sign on top of it. Repent. You can only wonder what about the sign carrier. Who the hell is he and what does he think he's doing? So can there be no communication without contamination? Without the peculiar message of this is me telling you? In the end, that does more to separate people than unite them. People don't like to be told things. There has to be a way of getting my message across without setting yourself up as a holy man. But shouldn't the need to send the message be proof enough that you are not a holy man? Doing it again, Jarrett. Straighten up. No more circular thinking. Exhausted, disgusted with himself, he leaves the Edens to the faster drivers, turns off on half-day road. He looks at his watch, nearly 12. He will be home in 5 minutes and he couldn't go to bed. Leave the rest of the world to the faster drivers. That's what he ought to do tonight. He pulls into the driveway, gets out of the car, and opens the garage door. Her car is there. Conrad's is parked on the circle in front of the house. Good. Everybody's safely home and waiting for him. He pulls in, closes the door, lets himself in through the kitchen. The oven light is on, an eerie glow in the dark room. He switches it off and makes his way towards the den, where another light is burning. Conrad is asleep on the couch, sitting up, his head back, hands in his lap. The television set is off. Cal stands a minute, looking down at him, his mind blank, thinking nothing, thinking only that he is very tired, so tired that he must get to bed immediately, or he will be flat with exhaustion again tomorrow. If he can help Ray clean up the worst of the work, he will not feel so guilty about leaving. He sets his briefcase down and takes off his coat. He touches Conrad's shoulder gently. Hey, he snaps upright, his eyes open, blinking. He rubs her hand over his mouth. Wait, he says. Wait a minute. Cal smiles. Okay. But he is still not awake. Staring vacantly ahead, confused and dazed, waking up as has always been a painful process for him, ever since he was a baby. A struggle. Sometimes he would spout gibberish, staring intently, the words formed from unknown syllables of a dark and primitive language. They would ask him questions. What are you talking about? What do you want? And he would answer, but not in any tongue they could understand. They would laugh and tease him about it the next day. He didn't believe it, never remembered anything. What did I say? He would ask. They would try to make the sounds, but it was a dialect known only to him, only at the edge of consciousness. He is conscious now, shading his eyes with his hands against the light. Time's it? 12. You just get home? Yeah, what are you doing down here? I couldn't sleep. Cal laughs. I see that. Time is it? He runs away to hang up his coat. I just told you, 12 o'clock. Let's go to bed, okay? I'm bushed. Wait a minute, he says. I need to talk to you. A note of urgency in the voice. He turns back, drops his coat on the arm of the chair. Oh shit. What's the matter? He's wiping his hand nervously again across his mouth. He does not look at Cal directly. Something happened today. At school. I got in a fight. A fight? He sits down in the chair. Who's with? Who with? Just a guy. You don't know him? Kevin Stillman. Sure, I know him. Diver on the swim team, isn't he? Yeah, I forgot. You'd remember him, yeah. What was the fight about? Nothing. I don't know. He's just a jerk. But I shouldn't have. I know that's no excuse. What happened? Asks. Did you get hurt? He looks up then. Me? No. He takes a breath and lets it out nervously. I think I hurt him though. What makes you think so? I don't know. There was a lot of blood. His nose. Was he on his feet? Yeah, I mean not at first, but he was when I left. Lisenby took him home, I think. Joe was there? Everybody was there, he says. Everybody from the swim team. I stayed to watch the meet, then I hung around for a while. They were all coming out of the locker room. That's when it happened. And it wasn't about anything. He shrugs. I guess it was about how he bugs the shit out of me and I bug the shit out of him. Well, now you know it, Cal says. Maybe you won't have to fight about it anymore, huh? He rubs the back of his neck with his hands. I called you around 7. You weren't here. I wondered where you were. I was here. Why didn't you answer? I don't know. He looks at the floor, his hands folded between his knees. Cal sees the start of a small mouse under his left eye. I thought it might be somebody else. Who? He won't look up, won't say what he's thinking. Relax, he's all right. Cal says. How do you know? I know, he says. It was just a fight. Guys have been fighting, have been getting in fights since school was invented. Think about it. Think about the last fight you were in. I was never in one, he says. What? I wasn't. This is it, the first one. You're kidding. I can't believe that. He shakes his head. Cal looks at him, thinking hard. Listen, a bloody nose is nothing. I'm telling you, he'll be there tomorrow. No, nothing to worry about. Once I broke my finger in a fight, knuckling a guy on the head. Doctor told me next time to use a baseball bat. He laughs, remembering, and Conrad looks up at last, grins faintly. You're not mad then? Mad? No, he says. I shouldn't have gone out of control like that, he says. I shouldn't have blown up. You never blow up, Cal says, then corrects himself. Hardly ever. I can count all the times you have blown up. You owed for yourself, so forget it. Not just to comfort, it is the truth. A disposition like an angel's, Ellen used to say. Sunny and sweet, he never got mad, and that wasn't good. Everybody has resentments, everybody has anger. He was one who kept everything inside. Cal has learned a thing or two from Crawford. Razoring is anger, self mutilation is anger. So, this is a good sign. He's turning his anger outward at last. But something bothers him still. You don't want to tell me what it was about? Conrad shrugs. I told him he was a crappy diver. He's got no sense of humor. He undresses in the dark, listening to the silky rush of her breathing, regular and smooth. She falls asleep in seconds. Another thing to be layered protectively over with logical reason, so as not to come upon it as an in an unguarded moment. She did not stop in the den on her way to bed. Maybe she assumed the light has been left on for him. She must not have looked in his room either, or she would have noticed that he was not in bed. He had asked on their way upstairs, did you hear your mother come in? Conrad had said no. Wouldn't she think it strange, him sleeping on the couch at whatever time she had come in? Wouldn't she have wakened him to ask at least? What the hell is wrong with her? 24. Chapter 24. Okay, I guess we're off. You've got the numbers, haven't you? He helps his father load the last of the suitcase into the trunk, slams the lid down. Yeah, have fun, play good. I'll try. His father reaches for his wallet. Let me give you some money. You already did, the morning, remember? You sure that will be enough? Plenty. His mother comes out of the house carrying her coat. She's wearing a dark green dress, banded with white at the throat and wrist. Her hair falls loosely, hiding her face, but he knows the expression she is wearing. A look reserved for airports and other public places. Remote, responding only to inner sounds today. They are completely contrast in attitudes. They are a complete contrast in attitudes. His father jokes with ticket agents, starts conversation with other passengers. On the plane, he will talk to the stewardess, ask them where are from, how they like their work. His mother will remain cool and aloof, as if she is alone on the plane. It is not her fault. She can't help it if she is afraid of strangers. Goodbye, mother, he says. Goodbye, she answers. Be nice to your grandmother. She gets in the car, shutting the door. Sun glints off the side window, obscuring her view from his view. That's it. She's afraid of strangers. Why hasn't it ever registered before? The flight gets in Wednesday at 4. You wait here, okay? We'll go out for dinner. Okay. His father smiles at him. Listen, don't let her push you around too much. 5 days, you can stand it for that long, can't you? Right. He looks at his watch. You heading over there pretty soon? As soon as you get out of the driveway. His father gives him a helpless grin. He can't resist organizing like things nice and neat. You got plans for this weekend? He asks. I thought I would cruise through town, run a few red lights, smoke some hash, get a couple girls in trouble. Nothing special, why? He smiles. Quit worrying, you're making me nervous. I'm not worrying, just take care, okay? I will. See you Wednesday. He waves them out of the driveway, then goes upstairs to his bedroom to get his own suitcase, thinking with longing of the comfortable silence of the empty house, of playing the stereo in his room and eating salami sandwiches, drinking beers, coming and going as he pleases, but his wouldn't work. His father wouldn't go under those conditions, and he had told him no, he wouldn't mind staying with his grandmother and grandfather in that house on Green Bay Road that reeks with the too sweet smell of her perfume, so that even the walls seem coated with it. It will cling to his clothing when he leaves. He loves his grandmother, but talking to her is like being on a loaded quiz show. Her questions defy answering. Have you completely lost your senses is one of her favorites. She uses it on his grandfather like a weapon, a whip to keep him in line. With him, the words are gentler, but the technique is the same. Maybe that is where his mother learned that there is danger in revealing too much. in giving his grandmother ammunition. Seated across from him at dinner, she eyes him sternly. You're letting your hair grow, aren't you? I don't let it, grandmother, it just does. All on its own. Well, I hope you're not turning into one of those hippie freaks. Howard, he needs some more meat. No thanks, I've had plenty. No more hippie freaks. She's 10 years behind the times on everything. In fourth grade, she wondered why they didn't wear short pants to school. In junior high, why they had abandoned rubber boots and raincoats. Where's your appetite? She demands. How can you put on weight eating like that? At least have more potatoes and gravy. He allows her to refill his plate, even though he is full, doesn't really mind her bossing him around. Last year, when the hole was closing over his head, there were no lectures, no words of criticism from anyone. He reads this statement as his good health. Today he is capable of improvement. How were your grades last semester? She asks. He answers with his mouth full, a feeble attempt to assert himself. Not bad. Two C's, a B, and an A. She clicks her tongue against her teeth, shaking her head. His grandfather says, Ellie, please let him eat. I'm wondering, she says, whatever happened to all those A's? I remember you getting all A's, and at the same time, you were playing golf, swimming, taking guitar lessons, tennis lessons. Sounds like I was overprogrammed. She sniffs. Overprogrammed. What's that? Keeping busy is not being overprogrammed, Conrad. What are you doing with all your time? Nothing much, he says. Ellie, for Pete's sake, his grandfather says. Too late. She's already launched into the lecture of the easy life, and he laugh listens as he pushes the peas and carrots around his plate. And you have absolutely no worries whatsoever about food or clothing or shelter. You're so protected. You can't even imagine what it was like in the old days. I mean, you shouldn't just thank your luck stars every night. My what? He asks. My luck what? She stares him down. You heard me. I don't believe you properly appreciate your advantages, Conrad. Being born into a good family, having a head on your shoulders. Is it fair to count that? Everybody's got one, grandmother. Her lips fold in. All right, make fun. It's the thing you do best anyway. He grins, coaxing a smile from her at last. Thanks, it's nice to be good at something. That night, he picks Janine up at work. The sign in the bakery shop window says closed, but the woman behind the register smiles and motions him to come inside. He remembers what Janine told him the first time he came to pick her up, that the woman warned the rest of the girls to keep an eye on him while she got to the telephone. She thought he was planning to stick up the place. He has a furtive look, she had said. He liked that image of himself as the bakery rip-off man, the girls cowering behind the counter in front of the neat brown loaves of bread, the sticky sweet cinnamon buns, everything waiting for his greedy hands. Okay, girlie, get those Danish twists off the counter and into the bag. No funny business. Janine weaves from the back room. Be right out. How about a cookie? The woman asks. Sure, thanks. He takes it, even though he's not hungry, he's stuffed from dinner. Still, it is rude to refuse, like refusing her friendship, her trust. Want the rest of this? He asks in the car. Ah, no, I don't think I'll eat another cookie as long as I live. Your parents gets off all right? Yeah, they left. How is it going? Oh, fine. I got real tough with the old lady right away. I'll bet. She slides over closer to him, squeezing his arm. What will we do? Good movie in Lake Bluff starts at 9:50. I should go home first, just to let her know. They ride the rest of the way to her house in silence, her hand on his arm, the soft purr of the heater backing up the music on the radio. As they round the corner, she suddenly sits up very straight in the seat. Damn, she says. Oh, damn. A black Buick is parked in the driveway. Looks like you've got company. She gets out of the car the instant he pulls it to the curb. He reads in the light from the street lamp the car's Ohio license plates. Is it your father? No, she says. Not my father. The porch light is on. The door opens as they come up the walk. Hi, honey. Her mother stands in the doorway. You remember Mr. Ferrier, don't you? The man is light-haired and heavy-set with a rough outdoor look about him. He reaches out to take Conrad's hand, smiling broadly. Jen, you're prettier than ever. Nice to meet you, Conrad Jarrett, you say? Any relation to the Jarretts who own the drugstores in Akron? No, I don't think so. He smiles at the man. He always admires these take charge guys. They make awkward situations like meeting people fast and simple. He glances at Janine. She's not smiling. Mrs. Pratt says, Paul and I were thinking about going to get a quick bite to eat. Honey, would you mind keeping an eye on Mike? I don't know, Janine says stiffly. We were going to the show. Her mother laughs nervously. Honey, Paul's on a business trip. He's only here for tonight. He's leaving tomorrow for Minneapolis. I'll bring her back early, mother, the man says, winking at Conrad. Don't worry. It's up it's up to Con. I don't mind, he says. He looks swiftly from mother to daughter. Good then, Paul says. He gathers Mrs. Pratt's coat from the arm of a chair. See you later. See you, Tiger. He reaches around the couch to ruffle Mike's hair, and they are gone. Out the door. It slams behind them. Mike peers over the back of the couch. Can we have popcorn tonight? Mom said. Janine doesn't answer. She stands staring at the television screen, her hands at her side, lips pressed tightly together. Conrad waits, feeling awkward as if he has come in on a movie in the middle. He peels out of his jacket and drops it on the chair. Let's make popcorn, he says. She looks at him. I'll make it. You stay here. Mike, turn down the TV. It's too loud. She disappears into the kitchen and Conrad sits beside Mike on the couch. What are you watching? Nothing. Friday night stinks. Hey, you wanna hear me play the guitar? Hey, yeah. When did you start? Couple weeks ago, Mom bought me a guitar. She says if I do good, she'll buy me a better one for my birthday. He listens to the chord C and G, D and A, E minor, A minor. After each chord change, Mike looks up expectantly. Fantastic, he rewards him. Terrific. Nah, but I don't think it will take me long to get good, do you? Nope, anyway, you got time. You have got your whole life, right? Mike hands him the guitar. Now you play something, he orders. He entertains him with a Simon and Garfunkel tune he remembers, then some James Taylor, John Denver, a little Eric Clapton for good measure. Hey, you are really good, you know. Way to go, Jared. Can't resist, can you? You sure can impress the hell out of those 11-year-olds. He hands the guitar back. It's not hard, he says. You keep working at it, you'll be able to do it in a while. In the kitchen, a cupboard door bangs. I'll go check on the popcorn, he says. She has her back to him, all business. Jen, what's the matter? Nothing, never mind. I'm acting dopey tonight, just forget it. Ignore it, okay? Okay, he says. He seemed like a nice enough guy to me. Well, he's not, she snaps. A man who dates a married woman, in my opinion, is not a nice guy. I thought your parents were divorced. They are. Now they are. They weren't before he came along. He was a friend of my father's. She stops abruptly. I'm sorry, this is all very boring for you. I'm not bored. Well, you should be. I am. And I don't like acting like this over it. And especially I don't like it in front of you. Why in front of me? He moves across the kitchen towards her and she quickly turns her head away. She's crying. Oh damn, she says. I'm sorry, I can't help it. Oh damn. He puts his arms around her. It's all right. He suits. It will work out all right. I don't think so. Her voice is husky. I kept hoping something would happen. I kept thinking they would decide to get back together, and I know that's just stupid. It's stupid even to think about it. They don't love each other. They just don't, and that's that. So why do I make such a big deal out of it? She pulls in her breath, and her arms are around his waist, and her head's on his chest. He stands holding her, tests the feeling of someone leaning on him, looking to him for support. He feels as if he could stand here holding her forever. Her lashes are wet, golden in the harsh overhead light. He lifts her chin with his hand and kisses her. Her face is tear-streaked, her mouth loose under his, lured slightly down. He has never felt so strong, so needed. Chapter 25. Audrey pours him a cup of coffee. Not much to celebrate with, is it? She smiles at him. Wart's going to stop for beer on his way back. He and Beth went riding. He's been dying to show her that horse. He leans back, relaxed. That's okay, I can wait. I'll just sail along on this high for a while. 71. That's really good, isn't it? I'm not much of a golfer. It's the best I'll do in this thing, I'm sure. I was playing over my head today. God, it was beautiful out there too. Summer comes early around here, doesn't it? Oh no, take my word, Cal. This isn't summer. Summer is absolutely unbearable. Where are the boys? He asks. They are right outside in the pool. Gee, they do look great. They're getting so big. I hardly recognize them. I know. I can almost see them grow myself. Their two sons, Charlie and Kerry, are 10 and 7 now, lively and wild, streaking through the house, snapping towels at each other's bottoms and thighs. They are built like Ward, plump and square, and they are large for their ages, blonde with Audrey's wide blue eyes. Charlie's such a daredevil, she says. He wants to do everything Ward does, and now Kerry's more cautious. Like his own, Buck was one he had to watch. Conrad had all the common sense that his children together were allotted. She puts a bowl of fruit on the table and sits down across from him. How is Con? She asks. Pretty good. I thought he must be. Ellen writes, but she doesn't tell me much. Her letters are, Hi, how are you? How are things? We are fine. Everything's fine. Not too informative. And I tried to talk to Beth last night. She made me feel like it was off limits, sort of. Then I started to worry a little. No, he's fine. A lot of subjects are coming off limits these days. On the flight down here, he had attempted a discussion of their summer plans. Would she like to go to London? Dubrovnik? Did she have something else in mind? She met his questions with polite indifference. Whatever he would like to do was fine with her. He took it as delayed punishment for Christmas. Okay, fair enough. But his try for a talk about the conversation he had with Ray in the bar was greeted with stony silence. She definitely did not want to hear any of it. She did not want to explain what she had meant in her talk with Nancy. If you don't know, Cal, it's hopeless for me to try to tell you. Oh, great, it's hopeless, he said. Terrific, it's hopeless. And she had twisted towards him in the seat, saying, Please, can't we just go and have a good time for these few days? Is that what you got me up here for? So you could make me say what you want me to say? Please, let's just not have any big discussions. Let's just relax and have fun for a change. So, okay, he blamed himself. He had come on too strong, maybe. He would relax. He would have fun. He would quit nagging her to confide in him. You're always so sincere, she said bitterly, and so pushy. But it surprises him that she would be as reserved as Audrey. She likes Audrey, and it was an honest question, an honest interest, not like Marty Genthes. Why duck it? He's in the process of making a discovery that he never knows how to read her, and she offers him no clues. There are fewer and fewer openings into the vast obscurity of her nature. He's on the outside looking in all the time. Has he always been? I know, Audrey says, that you have to be careful with Beth. I mean, emotions is her enemy. She wants everything to go smoothly, to go right, the way she's planned it. Is it that obvious? Is it even true? He remembers Carol Lazenby's word at lunch that day. She's a perfectionist. She never lets herself get trapped. Oh God, that is not true. Not true at all. Once she was trapped and she knew it. She knew it then. A night in August, hot and sticky. She had gone out for a walk alone. He sat alone in the living room, thinking about the set of her shoulders. As she walked away from the house, she had looked so small, so sad. And he had gotten up, gone after her, found her in the backyard, weeping and trying not to weep. Those dry, tight sobs. It was the only time he saw her cry. She had not cried at the funeral, not at all. He had cried. Howard and Ellen had cried. But she and Con had been the stony and calm throughout. The scene in the garden had come later, much later. After Con, after the other thing, she had crouched on the ground with him beside her, crying over and over. How did this happen? How did it happen? And nothing he said could reach her. She was grieving. He had thought it was a good thing at last. She had not been able to before. Now she could. They had neither of them cried that night on the dock. Too awesome, too catastrophic for tears. That murderous lead-colored moon, the sky wispy with cloud strings, the black water all around them, indistinguishable from this black sky. The people who didn't know who they were, only that something terrible had happened. Those kids never should have been out there without power. A man next to him had answered. Doesn't make any difference. The lake whips up like that and it doesn't make any difference, power or not. And the radioed message from the cruiser. We found her, sir. She's demasted. Only one on board. Sorry. Sorry. They'll find him, she had said, gripping his arm. They will find them both. Her hand had felt small and childlike in his. What had it been like out there? He had often wondered. Impressive. Enough to rob them of happiness, of security, of the easy peace of mind that is nothing but lucky accident. Enough to put Corn in the hospital for 8 months. They had not found them both. They had not been able to find Buck for 2 days. Morbid thoughts. He looks across the table at Audrey, who is frowning slightly at him. Is something wrong, Cal? I mean, something else? No, he says. What could be wrong? Here I sit with my lovely sister in law at 71 under my belt, on the way to winning the first tournament on my career. Of my career, what could be wrong? A car has pulled in the driveway, and Watt's voice, booming through the door, greets him. Hey, you big city dude, how would you make out? I made out great, he says. What did you shoot? She follows Ward into the kitchen, looking like a 16-year-old in jeans and a red checkered shirt, her hair in pigtails. 71, Audrey says. 71? Oh, Carl, that's marvelous. That's just great. Oh, you're going to win in this year. You really are. Hey, he says, you'll jinx me. Nobody did better, did they? Not today. Still 2 days to go, though. Ward sets down the case of beer in middle of the kitchen. What you need, he says, is an early ride tomorrow to set you up. He laughs, looking at Beth. Her eyes are alive, her cheeks burned from the sun. She is freeing her hair from the braids, tossing it back over her shoulder. Listen, I had her on the biggest damn horse you ever saw today, and she was beautiful. She's got great hands. Oh, shut up, Ward. She looks at him, laughing. Buy her a big Appaloosa. Keep it in your backyard over there in Leafy Lake Forest. Why is it that Texan always confuse big with best? Cal teases. Just like that crazy airport. Jesus, I thought O'Hare was bad. Well, we have got a few problems in around iron out. Well, we have got few problems to iron out yet, Ward says. He has turned over the past 5 years into a native Texan with the drawl, the handlebar moustache, the hat, the boots, the works. He does not look like a computer company executive. But that is what he is. The image he prefers to project, however, is pure cowboy. Hey, let's break out the course. We'll celebrate the company and the beautiful day and a big 71 tomorrow. Little 71, Beth corrects him. What are we doing for dinner tonight? I'm starved. Let's just throw some steaks on the grill, how's that? And can whip up a salad. We'll be in business. He ruffles his sister's hair affectionately. Hey, I'm glad to see you so cheerful, Sissy. Things going good for you again, huh? A pause, a half setup off the beat. She does not look at Cal. Yes, she says. Things are going fine. Good, I'm glad you could come. Mom and Dad wrote and said Corn was staying with them, huh? Yes, she says. So what's the status? How is he doing? Everything okay? Everything is fine, what? He does not catch the slight frown. He seeing anybody? I hear you do that sometimes, like an outpatient sort of thing. He's seeing a doctor in Evanston, Cal says. Twice a week? No, once a week now. He's coming along. Twice a week? Ward lets out a low whistle. That must have kept you pretty busy at the office, huh, Carl? It was worth it. Beth is studying her wristwatch intently, a platinum watch set with diamonds. His gift to her on their 15th anniversary. In April, they will have been married 21 years. Listen, I'm not kidding, Ward says. Tomorrow morning before you tee off, just a good brisk ride. It will do great things for you. He laughs. No thanks, I stick to my sport. You two go ahead. Did I tell you not to marry a dude, sissy? Hey, this sissy sister of mine writes better than anybody around here. So do well tomorrow or we'll send you back east by yourself. That brings us to the end of chapter 25. We'll be continuing from chapter 26 in the next reading. If you have any comments, any kind of criticism, feedback, suggestions, recommendations for our next reading, anything, at all, you can reach out in the comment section of the video you're viewing or in the community section. Keep reading, take care, and if you have not subscribed yet to the channel, do subscribe, like, and share. Bye bye for now. Keep reading.